Um, I don't actually know how to start this one because it's a bit different.
Hello.
But yeah, welcome back to the KultureKast podcast. This is going to be a bit of a different episode as we're going to be talking about the farmers' issue, which is happening in India at the moment, the farmers' protest. And because it's such a big topic, I've enlisted the help of my two amazing guests. First is returning onto the podcast and professional boxer, Mr. Inder Bassi. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you, my brother. I'm all good.
Good. And secondly is Dr. Sharandeep Singh of Sikhs in Scotland. How are you doing?
Great to be here. I'm doing very good.
Good. Sharandeep is actually a doctor from the NHS, working in Glasgow. So just before we begin, I'd like to say a huge thank you to you and all the other frontline workers who were smashing it during this pandemic. It's very much appreciated. And a quick other caveat is that we are not experts. There's a bit of a disclaimer here. We're very passionate about the subject. We have done our research before recording this. However, we encourage everybody to do their own research, educate themselves, and raise awareness on this issue. Inder, do you want to start off with a bit of context of what's going on?
Yes, definitely. Like you said, this is not your usual podcast, but it's very fitting right now because what's going on in India right now. And it's not just limited to India. We must realize, the largest protest in the world. What started off in Punjab, local people getting together in their cities and towns, now is all across India, and now is resonating throughout the world. So it's only right, we do this. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, definitely. Just a few statistics here is that it's the largest protest in history with over 250 million people actively protesting. And as you say, it's not just a Punjab issue or anything. It is affecting a lot of people in India because 60% of the 1.366 billion people in India work in the agricultural industry. So it does affect more than 800 million people. 800 million is more than the entire population of Europe. So it is a really big issue. To sort of understand what's happening, I think we need to understand what was happening beforehand, before these bills got put into place. So Sharandeep, is it okay if you tell us about the Mundi system and what was in place before the bills are trying to change this?
Yeah, sure. So most of the kind of knowledge and information that I have kind of picked up, pre the farmers' protest is just very much from, being present on holidays to Punjab, to India, where majority of my family is involved in agriculture. So when we were going on holidays there, we were living on the cool, as they say, which is a kind of farmhouse in the middle of the field. So this is something that we've been surrounded by ever since our childhood trips, but it's probably only recently with these protests and with these laws that I've really gone down and drilled into the kind of deeper technical aspects of how the farming infrastructure works. And as you've rightly said, this is an industry upon which hundreds of millions of people's lives and livelihoods rest on. So prior to the so-called reforms that have been introduced in the laws last year, the process by which a farmer would be able to really get his income from his labour was through the Mundi system, which is a kind of localised and regulated and licensed market. And these are markets which are very, very local. They're very, very regionalized. So they serve, very discrete areas. And over time, the farmers, get to know those agents who are working within those Mundis, those markets. And the reason that they're licensed and regulated by the government, firstly, is just from a tax perspective. The government loves tax and they like to make their money somehow, and so they will regulate these environments so that they can generate their state income out of it. But it's also to make sure that the standards are being met, so that the quality standards for food are being met, the storage standards for food are being met, and also that the income standards to a certain extent for those farmers. The money that is exchanging is reaching the hard workers who have produced that food. I think the critical thing, which is possibly a bit more unique to India, is that despite being such a huge country, it is still very much a developing country. It's not quite there to the developed level. I think I've read articles that state that it's maybe 20, 25 years behind where China is now. So from an economic growth perspective, India still does lag behind in certain ways. And one of the ways in which it does is the poverty level and the population that is below the poverty level. And we're familiar in this country, we have a welfare system, we have a free healthcare system. That kind of thing doesn't really exist within India because they often can't afford it. But the one welfare system that they do have, which is very good, is supplied through something called the Food Corporation of India, which provides significantly subsidized essential food, so lentils, rice, grain, flour, and distributes it to hundreds of millions of people who live below the poverty line. So within this agricultural infrastructure, the government is actually a key buyer. So the government is one of the biggest buyers of food through this Mandi system. So the government is not just some kind of external regulator. They're one of the big buyers of this food that's produce that is produced by the farmers. And so the farmers, they are also being supported by these major welfare schemes as well. So the government is not neutral because it's paying this money to those farmers, and a big chunk of the income that farmers make is through the Food Corporation of India scheme and the welfare scheme. So you can see actually how there is a slightly more interconnected web here, and this is why the reforms that were introduced have really upended what has been a decade-long system. And unfortunately, Modi's kind of MO seems to be to introduce really, really significant reforms overnight. Demonetization comes to mind, where he just cancelled everyone's money overnight and decided to print a new currency, and we remember the havoc that caused. And it seems that he very much tried to do the same thing here with the farmer laws and the infrastructure, but this slightly more significant reform has come back to haunt him.
Yeah, I was actually in India when that currency thing happened as well for a wedding, and it was havoc. But just to go back to the farming situation, so through the podcast you might hear something called MSP, which is minimum support price, that we'll probably end up talking about a bit more. And this is basically what Sharandeep just said is the subsidies. So when a farmer goes to the mandi, they'll sell their produce, but they'll be guaranteed a certain minimum price. And this is one of the things that I think the government want to reform in the three laws. Because I was reading on an article that basically the bigger farmers, obviously because it's at a higher scale, can get more profit. However, the biggest difference in subsidies in this case is that in India there are a lot more farmers than say Western countries like Europe and America. But they have like a ridiculously small amount of land compared to, say, America. So just to put this into context, an Indian farmer on average owns around 1 hectare of land, whereas in America, this is around 444 acres of land. So obviously the contrast there is mental, but the bigger farmers obviously would earn a lot more money from taking their produce than the smaller farmers, but there are just a lot more smaller farmers in India. And when we're talking about sort of income and poverty, we've got a few statistics as well regarding like average incomes and things. If Inder, do you want to rattle some of these off?
Yeah, I mean, just a point that you made about the MSP. The MSP is a massive point. It's a massive thing for a lot of farmers. Like you said, there are a lot more farmers, but they're all smaller farmers. They're smaller size of land. And I was reading an article as well about a farm from Bihar where these laws were introduced in 2007.
2006, I believe.
2006, yeah. And he said from every year, so after 2006, the farming went up for a year or two, and after that, it's coming down every single year. the income. And he was saying, this is a guy from Bihar who's from Bihar. He's a farmer. He said, what we do is, because we're not guaranteed a minimum MSP, a minimum support price, we sell our produce to Punjab. So what they would do, they'll have middlemen. And this is an illegal practice, but he said we still earn more money. So they'll have someone like me, for example. I'll say, I'll take your produce, whatever you've grown, 10 acres worth of onions, for example. I'll illegally take them to Punjab and sell them for the MSP. And however, the farmer who does that, so he has to pay for transportation costs, middleman. I'm the middleman. I'm gonna take a cut, and all those things included. He still earns more money than what he would do if he sold directly to anybody else, for example, because he's not guaranteed MSP. And that farmer there was crying. He was in tears. And he was saying, that's my only option. He goes, India's a big country, so from him to go to Bihar. I went to Bihar. The Patna Sahib got dollars there. For him to go to all the way to Punjab just to get that minimum MSP, knowing it's illegal, he's going to lose a lot of money to middlemen, to transportation costs. He's still willing to do that because he knows he will get more money. And this is going to be introduced all over India, and it's going to kill all the farmers, because, like you said, if every farmer in India owned an average of 100 acres of land, it's no problem. I can afford to pay transportation costs. I can afford to get rid of it all to one big company. But the guy who only owns 2 acres of land, for example, he's going to struggle very badly. But there's a lot of things that are wrong with it. Like people say, oh, the agricultural farmers in decline and everything. Yeah, the agricultural market needs change, but the change cannot come around without speaking to any organization or body that represents farmers. Change is needed, but the way he's done and the process in which they brought these laws, I don't know if you've seen the video.
Yeah.
All those in favor, and it's crazy. It's like something you wouldn't necessarily believe that's happening in 2021 in the world's largest democracy. And like I said, the government is there to serve the people. If the people aren't happy, something has to be done. It's common. It's not, India's not a dictatorship. It's the world's largest democracy. And there's loads of things, like one of the statistics that Bihar has the lowest state average. In the notes it says it got rid of it in 2006. So we don't have to say Bihar is projected to do this, or the introduction of MSP we believe is going to do this, because that's incorrect. We can see, we can look at numbers, and numbers don't lie. We don't have to project. I believe that these new laws are going to be in favor of the farmers. I believe that this is going to happen, or according to statistics. We have to look at these statistics and say this is what's happened, and this is what will happen to the rest of the farmers. But for some reason, Mr. Modi doesn't want to listen.
Yeah, it's interesting because we're talking about the minimum support price. So you referenced the comparison between the different states within India, and the most prominent example being Bihar, which has already, over the past decade or so, been implementing this system, and the data is very, very clear in terms of income levels within those states, and also the anecdotes like you shared of how the farmers use the system or the loopholes in the system in order to try and overcome those barriers. But if you look at it on even a global level, over the past few years, we in Britain have been consumed by Brexit and the EU, and one of the biggest policies within the EU budget was something called the Common Agricultural Policy, and that was actually huge significant portion of the annual EU budget, specifically related to farming and farmers. And what that was all about was within the trade zone of the EU, they made sure that they would be safeguarding the incomes of the different farmers within the EU, to make sure that there was that income stability, to make sure that there was price stability. And it's quite clear, from our own family, my own family in India, that the farmers there don't regard the pre-existing system as perfect. They are not anti-reform. They are not stuck in the past, but their major objection is that these laws were not passed with their consultation, and it wasn't done within the interests of what they needed. And we've been talking about the minimum support price within India, and I was actually quite surprised to learn recently that there's actually no legal basis for the minimum support price. It's not actually written into law specifically, and even within these new laws. But what the Mandi system guaranteed, because the agents in the Mandi had to get a license from the government to operate, one of the conditions of that license would be to make sure that the Mandi would be purchasing at the minimum support price. So although the law doesn't guarantee it, their license depends on it. So they had to make sure that they, at least in the public setting, were making sure that their transactions were going based on that MSP. And the minimum support price is a very, very specific number, and it's calculated twice a year by the central government. And what they do is they look at all the input costs for farming. So they'll look at the fuel, the equipment required, they'll look at the fertilizers needed, they'll look at the seed costs, they'll also look at how much it costs for labor, and they'll also look at what they call the C2 costs, which is the unaccounted for work that gets taken place within the agricultural economy. And we know actually that families end up bearing the burden. So if a farmer has a field, within that field, his wife will be doing something, his son will be doing something, his daughter will be doing something. He doesn't necessarily pay them a wage, but his income needs to be able to support that. And so twice a year, what they do is they come up with a formula and calculate all those input costs, all those labor costs, and they publish that minimum support price. And you can see then how comprehensive that MSP is, because it does cover all the costs associated with farming, and it makes sure that the farmer is able to not make a loss, and also is able to generate a profit so that they can, grow and take on extra burdens or extra costs as well.
Yeah, exactly. So it is basically a form of a subsidy, which is going back to what you were saying before about the European Union. They have CAP in place, and then America also has. I'm pretty sure they had historic numbers of subsidies within the past couple of years. They gave $28 billion in 2018 to 2020 to their farmers as a form of subsidy, which means the average American farmer got around £100,000 per year. And as we were going into incomes beforehand, just to rattle off these numbers fairly quickly, I'm going to say them in rupees and then I'll put them into pounds, just so that those that are in like the UK like us can sort of fathom how much of the how little this money is, because as you mentioned before, like it is like a poverty stricken sort of ballpark numbers these are. So the average income of an Indian farmer is roughly 77,124 rupees per year, which is around £770 a year, which is again nuts. And Punjab, as we already mentioned, is the highest average state because they still have the Mandi system in place, which is 216,708 rupees per year, which is roughly £2,170 per year. Bihar, as we mentioned, has the lowest state average, which is only 42,684 rupees per year, and that is equivalent to £426.90. And as Inder already mentioned, they got rid of the Mandi system in 2006, and obviously Punjab still has it, and there's a significant difference there. These numbers were from India Today and the Business Standard for numbers from 2019. So this is before the bills were in place, which is important to note, because it sort of paints the picture of the landscape beforehand. And as we were speaking about America, their average income is around $83,000 per year. So there's a vast difference there. And we're not saying that the Mandi system is perfect, because obviously them numbers sort of paint the picture that it's still relatively little amounts of money. And this has had an impact also on suicide rates. India's got one of the highest suicide rates in the world for farmers, with in 2019, 10,281 farmers or farm laborers committed suicide. So it's not a perfect picture. They did need support in the reforms, but unfortunately, it's went the other way with the 3 bills that have been passed. So I think now is probably the better. We've painted the picture of what was happening before these bills got passed. I think we should probably talk about the 3 bills themselves. So, Sharandeep, do you want to talk about these bills?
Yeah, so it's kind of around about this late summer time last year. I believe that there was the passing of these bills, and they're actually split up into 3 bills. So there's one called the Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Bill, the Farmers Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Bill, and the third one is the Essential Commodities Bill. And each of these laws deregulates certain aspects of the farming infrastructure and the farming landscape within India, so that it is a comprehensive wholesale gut out of how farmers work in the system that they currently know about. And it's interesting because there's different ways that legislation can be passed. And one of the things that was actually the tactics used by the Modi government was to pass these bills as ordinances, which changes the way in which you have to, there's legal duties that the government has to fulfill to pass a law. And some of those things involve a period of consultation. Some of them involve making sure that committees of the parliament get to scrutinise the bill and bring amendments to those bills. And none of those steps were taking place because they used something called an ordinance. And an ordinance is a tool that the government has to pass a law in an emergency situation. So we know that, for example, we've all been dealing with the COVID pandemic. The government has been, extending its powers significantly. For example, making sure that we have a lockdown, making sure that businesses get supported, etc., etc. So the ordinance tool for a government is to be used in an emergency situation, in a fast-paced situation, and it's there to be used as kind of a tool that is a temporary measure to deal with something unexpected. Now, farming in India is not something new. Farming reform has not been discussed just overnight. Farmers have been discussing this for decades. During the British era, for example, during the post-independence period, after the so-called Green Revolution. So this is not something that was an emergency. This was not something that suddenly needed to happen, but they used that tool, the ordinance tool, and to evade that scrutiny. And the most egregious example of their tactics was the day that they passed the vote in Parliament itself. And so when in a parliamentary system, every member of Parliament gets to cast a vote. It's not just the government that gets to say. Every individual MP needs to cast their vote for a law. And what they do is when there's a division in the Parliament where there's not a full agreement, then they would walk through a lobby, or they might press a button, for example, in an electronic system so that they can all cast a vote. But what they used, or the Speaker of the House of Parliament at that time, he passed these bills on what is called a vita voce vote, which is a voice vote, where he said all those in favour of the vote say aye, all those in favour of the vote say no, and based on his hearing, he decided that the yes vote was louder than the no vote, and therefore these laws were passed, which affect 800 million people.
Yeah.
So it seems slightly farcical, it seems slightly comical that in what is a mature parliament, 60, 70 years old, that something like this could happen. But it's just a series of steps that they've taken that really do seed this doubts in our mind of what their intentions actually were.
Yeah, I just want to say that Inder sort of mentioned this beforehand as well. There are videos of that occasion that you've just mentioned, of the vocal vote that are plastered online. So if anybody hasn't seen that, definitely do watch it, because it is I would say it was comical if the result wasn't so drastic. Do you know what I mean? Like in any other circumstance, you would look and think that's not how this should work, and you would sort of laugh at it. But because it has resulted in what has happened, it's, you can't even say it's comical. Do you know what I mean? It's just ridiculous, really. Do you want to sort of, so the impact of these bills has sort of happened, and then the farmers are retaliating against these bills because they haven't been consulted. That's not a word. Consulted. Oh my god, English going out the window. Yeah, consulted. Yeah, so they haven't been consulted, and they want these bills to be repealed. So, what is your knowledge of sort of what the farmers want?
Yeah, so well, again, I think they want, first and foremost, and that's something that all farmers seem to be adamant on, is they want these three laws repealed. You know, they don't want them put on hold. They don't want anything to do with these three laws, and that means that they want them repealed. So that is something the farmers want. You know, there was something today where Modi said, let's keep these three laws for the time being. Let's see how they work. And, you know, in a year's time or X amount of months' time, we will see how they look, see how they go. And if needed, we'll change them and everything. But like I said, the farmers in India, and like I said earlier, they're not limited to Punjab. It's not just, you know, the four walls of Punjab, so to speak. It's all of India. They want the three laws repealed. And so I think the government has to respect that. The government have a duty to respect what the farmers want. Like I said, at the end of the day, they're the ones working in the field, in the rain, in the sun, in the snow, and you know, and like we know, farming is not an easy industry to go in. The suicide that is involved, and you know, the things in general, you know, like in all fields of work, but agriculture a bit more, they deserve to be listened to. So I think, yeah, like I said, whatever the laws are, whatever they state, the first thing that 90% of farmers want is the laws to be repealed, and they're not going to go, as they've said, you know, they've said, you know, we're not going to go back home until these laws are taken back.
It's a very important principle within democracy that, you know, you don't make laws about something or someone without consulting the people
Exactly.
that are affected by those issues. That is the
Exactly.
key feature of a democracy. You know, there are other ways countries govern themselves. You have monarchies, you have dictatorships, you have communist countries, socialist countries, etc. But the key feature of a democracy is a law or a bill that's passed is done with the consultation of the people itself. It's not done by the order of some, you know, preordained, you know, leader or some secret committee. That's just not the way. And the Constitution of India itself, which the BJP in particular and some of the right-wing people, you know, they love to talk about the Constitution of India, but they're very quick to ignore it or avoid certain conditions when it suits them. And going back to the bills itself, you know, we've kind of talked a little bit about the Mondays. I think it'd be useful to just discuss some of the details and the consequences of the three separate bills and what each of them does. So there's the commodities bill, for example, is you know, food poverty is very, very scarce. You know, within India, you know, people are extremely malnourished. You know, a lot of people don't even get 3 square meals a day. So what the previous commodities bills were there to make sure that food is affordable, that, you know, things can't just suddenly, you know, for example, we are going out to fill up our car with petrol. You don't know what the price of petrol is going to be until you get to the petrol station. Mm-hmm. You know, one day it could be £1, the other day it could be £1.10, the other day it could be £1.20, the other day it could be £1.30. It's totally unpredictable, right? But that's the system that the way oil is treated. Oil is not food, though. You know, you cannot expect, you know, onions, core vegetables, core lentils every day to be changing prices in a country where there's so much poverty already. Those people need stability, they need continuity, they need to make sure that there's not profiteering or excessive profiteering being done on essential items like food. Now, what the new bill that Modi's passed on commodities has done is he's allowed certain freedoms for companies. So what they can do is they can now buy in bulk. You know, they can buy cereals, pulses, vegetables. They can buy it in bulk and they can store it. They can store it in a warehouse for however long they want. And with modern technology, we have, you know, temperature controlled fridges, temperature controlled freezers. You can keep these items for months, if not years on end. And what that does is if those companies start to hoard that food within their warehouses, there's less food to go around, the prices go up because there's more people competing for that food. if they want the food to go cheaper, if they've stored all that food, all of a sudden what they need to do is just release all that stock that they've got onto the market, and then the prices collapse. So this power that they're handing over to companies is really, really dangerous for the ordinary Indian consumer. And their security of food supply is really, really being threatened. And that is a major, major change. One of the other bills, the Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services, what that does is it allows a company to directly go to a farmer and set a contract with him to say that you need to, we'll enter into a contract with you, you supply us X produce of X quality, and we'll collect it at an X date. But what the contract farming does is it essentially makes the farmer an employee of that company, because he's doing work for them based on that contract, but it doesn't give him any of the protections of an employee. When we have our jobs, we have sick leave, we have, certain employment rights, we have a guaranteed wage system, all this kind of stuff. But what the contract farming does is it makes him an employee, but it doesn't give him any of the protections.
It's sort of similar like how Uber got into disputes over their taxi drivers, just to put it into sort of context in a Western sort of setting, just so other people can relate to it. Is like Uber has this problem, like most of these delivery apps have this problem where you are basically self-employed, but you're also an employee at the same time. Sorry to interrupt there, but it was just like sort of to put it into context for Western countries.
Yeah, absolutely. And, over the last 10 years since the financial crisis, we have seen within Western economies and Western countries, the security of a job has just evaporated. As a young person, I'm very, very fortunate, within my profession, but I know so many of my peers that, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when you got a job with a company, you were set, you had that security of that job, and you knew that the company was going to look after you as your life went on, as your family grew up, you got a house, you needed to pay for your kids' education, your job and your salary would go up in line with that. But what we have seen is that, for example, as you've given, the gig economy jobs, which like the Uber and the Deliveroos and the Amazons, what they have done is they have essentially, taken away all of those responsibilities that they have as an employer, but they still get to get all the benefits and all the profit and all the money from that. And that's one of the things that the farmers are very, very concerned about when it comes to so-called contract farming, is that they don't want that relationship, because we've already pointed out, majority of farmers within India have maybe about 5 acres of land, and they don't have the influence. They don't have the bargaining power when they're sitting in front of a company, a big company, a multinational food corporation. They don't have the power and the say to actually make that company do what's in their interests. And that's a really, really big change. And the third bill, which is related to the Mandi system that we talked about. So the Mandi system is that local buyer, the farmer has a relationship with them. One of the things that I was really interested to learn about from my family, I asked them, I'd never heard of the Mandi before. I used to hear people in the house talking about it, being like, oh, Mandi no janaya, or we need to take our produce to the Mandi. And I was like, where is Mandi? Is it a town? Is it a village? I didn't realize that it was an actual marketplace. So the Mandi system is actually a very, very integrated part of the economy of the agricultural life there. And I was asking my uncles, what is their perception of the Mandi system? And they were like, it's got its benefits and it's got its downsides, but there are certain things that, the Mandi system does have its advantages on, and it also affects not just the economic life of farmers, but it also affects the social life of farmers. So one of the examples that was given to me was that within the Mandi system, once they become a regular participant in that market, they then get the what they call the credit lines issued to them. So the agents that are buying their stock, they have that reliability and that relationship with them. So when there's a big event coming up, for example, a wedding, they need to buy a new car or a new tractor, if they have to pay certain, fees, or if they've got family maybe going abroad, a big lump sum cost that's coming up. And say that's, most of the time the harvests are April time and November time, and that's when they get their money. If this cost comes up, say in February, and we know that most Indian weddings happen in February time, that's major wedding season. So what that farmer can do is he can go to the Mundi, speak to the Mundi agent, say, my son or daughter's getting married in February, and can I get an advance on my stock, which I'll be bringing to you in April or May. And because they have that local connection, they have that local relationship with that agent, they have that ability to take advantage of that. And if a farmer is in a contract with a major company, they're not going to be able to say, oh, my daughter's getting married, can I get, if there's this multi-billion-pound company that has these contracts with them, they're not going to get that flexibility. And it was really interesting to hear that example, because it just goes to show how embedded the Mandi system is, not just in the economic life of Punjab and India, but also the social fabric of these people's lives.
Yeah, 100%. It's like, again, example over here is that you wouldn't ask your employer, your boss, like, oh, I can have a car because I'm getting married next year or something. But if you do have that relationship, and it is so much in the lifestyle there, then it's a completely different ballgame. That's why, like, I'm trying to use as many examples as the West as possible, but there's some things that you just can't really relate to, can you? Because over here is a complete different system. Just to make it easier for people to understand who might not be fully embedded into the Indian culture. Right, so these three bills have been passed, and then the protest wasn't. It's not like the bills were passed one day and then the next day everybody just rocked up on the borders of Delhi. That's obviously, it's like a slow progression that's got there. It was very much just people being vocal at first, and then like slowly escalating to this point. We should say that we've already mentioned it a few times, like alluded to it, but the farmers basically are opposing these laws because they feel like they'll be at the mercy of big corporations. Their minimum support price, will be out of the window, and then they won't even have any leverage or anything to negotiate with big companies. Because, as I say, in the Western countries, there is still like the way that cap works is that any unsold produce the government sort of buys off the farmer. That's how like it works in the European Union. So there's still sort of like a fallback. If you get rid of the cap system, the MSP, in India, then they probably think that the corporations will just set any price and they'll be forced to take it because there's going to be no other buyers, leaving them at the mercy of corporations and maybe even taking a loss further down the line, maybe having to sell their land, so on and so forth.
But yeah, it's not a maybe though. It is happening.
Mm-hmm.
It's happening in Bihar. Like I said earlier, we can't just, it's not just a case of it could happen or it may happen.
Yeah.
It's happening, and we have legit examples to look at it from. But yeah, sorry, that was just a quick point that people seem to forget sometimes, that it's not a case of if the laws are introduced and this is going to happen or could happen, it's happening. So we only have to just you look over at Bihar, for example. We keep using Bihar, but that's a very fresh, very live, very real example.
Well, it's a case study to look back on. Back on, do you know what I mean? Like, definitely. So, when the protest started, what were the initial steps that were taken by farmers, and then how did it escalate to the point where it became one of the largest protests in the world?
I mean, it just, like I said, it was on Sikh channel. It was on just people getting together in the local towns, in the local, for example, a local district, or singers, and those kind of people, those in the public eye were just getting together. Loads of people getting together, protesting these laws. And I'm not gonna lie, I didn't pay too much attention to it at the beginning. I knew what it was and I knew they were protesting, but like I said, I just sort of dismissed it. There's always protests going on, and Punjab and India more than ever, there always seems to be some sort of problem. I didn't pay too much attention, but as time went on, and we didn't understand, or sorry, I didn't appreciate the severity of these laws. I might have overlooked them myself. And the more kind of it was on the media, and then the changing point for me was when they decided to go to Delhi. So they've left their homes now. They come a point when they thought, what, no one's listening to us. People, myself included, are not taking us seriously. they moved to Delhi, and when they moved to Delhi, and I don't think the average person understands how big of a thing this is. Like you said earlier on, farming is not. It's not, as much as it's a job. It's not like a normal job. It's not like you go to work. You're a teacher, for example, or you work, or you're a professional boxer like myself. It's farming is culture. It's history. It's much more. It means a lot more to a farmer than someone like me can ever imagine. And I think a key point in the movement was when, like I said earlier on, they went to Delhi and they camped. And they're still camping, in the cold, in the wind, in the rain, whatever. They are sitting there, and sometimes I sit and think about it, how amazing it would be, because I know a few people have actually gone, and gone from England to think, and they said the vibe there is unbelievable. The atmosphere is serene. I was watching an interview on Sikh Times. It's a Muslim lady, like it's a lot of people saying, oh, it's just Sikh people, oh, they're just always causing problems. It was a Muslim lady, and she said she's like a woman's right activist, and she wears a hijab. So she goes, as a woman, I don't feel safe in India. India is not safe for women. But she goes, to those people, myself included, she said, to those people who felt like India was never safe, come to these borders right now. Come to Singhu border, come to Tikri border, Ghazi border, come to these borders where these protests are being held, and tell me you don't feel safe. She goes, I was one of those people. She admitted on live TV, I was one of those people that said India is not safe. But the scope, the magnitude of these events is unbelievable. And despite innocent people are losing their lives, this movement is showing more than one thing. It showed so many things. Again, Punjab has stood up once again at the forefront of something that is unbelievable. The average person doesn't understand. There was, for Black Lives Matter protests, people don't understand what these are still protests, but like I said, the scope, the magnitude, people living there. There's food, there's education, there's shelter, there's medicine, there's everything. There's security is in a safe like place for people to stay, people to live. These are not ordinary protests that just can. I think the word protest doesn't do it justice, and sometimes, the word protest. I went to the protest in London. I carried a flag, walked around for a few hours, and come back, and I was tired. I think, what, I've done a lot today. I felt happy with myself. I feel like I've done a big thing. But these people are living there. They're living there, and older people, older than me, far older than me, who, some people there who haven't got an arm, haven't got a leg, but they're still there. And I feel like the word protest doesn't do it justice. There needs to be a new word.
Just to piggyback off that as well, you said like the sort of like 9-to-5 job, or yourself as a professional boxer, like there is a difference in farming compared to any other job, because you can't take a break. Do you know what I mean? Your crops aren't going to stop growing if you go to Delhi, and I think that's the important thing, that people are sacrificing their livelihoods in the short term so they don't have to sacrifice it in the long term. Like Delhi to Punjab to do that march, and not just Punjab but other places in India, everyone's commuting. And India is a big place. Do you know what I mean? Like it's 8 to 10 hours plus journey. Some people are doing it not even with vehicles. There's plenty of videos where you see people either on bicycles, even walking there, running, whatever they can to get there and join this movement. Perhaps movement's the better word than protest.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, farming is a lifestyle. We know from our musical culture, for example, how much the music has been embedded within farming, and actually that's why there's been so much discontent towards the musical artists and celebrities who have stayed silent, because they've made their money off of the farmers. They've made and appropriated the culture of farming. And yet when it came to speaking up for these farmer protest movements, they have been silent. And all credit goes to these farmers, the tenacity, the strength with which they have tilled the soil for decades, with which they have fed hundreds of millions of people. They have brought that same energy, they have brought that same passion to standing up for their rights at this moment in time. And it has been a long, slow process. For a lot of people maybe listening to this podcast, you might think, oh, all of a sudden it just appeared like that on Rihanna's Twitter timeline,
which we'll get to soon. We'll get to soon.
I'm a big fan of Rihanna now. I'm a big fan. She's on my playlist on loop.
but as you've alluded to, they've been there for over 70 days now. You know what I mean? It's not so, like, obviously Rihanna's tweet was maybe 60 plus days in. It's almost 2 months. And as Inder said before, people are camping out on the streets during the winter as well. So these 2 months have been during some of the harshest and coldest conditions in basically India's sort of yearly sort of weather cycle. So it isn't good. And the next sort of thing related to the protest that I want to talk about is the human rights violations. So obviously now that it is becoming more public, and alluding to there, like Rihanna's tweet has made a more international scope on what's happening, but the amount of human rights violations that have occurred. So I seen a stat yesterday, which is 204 people, I think, known people have died during this protest. Obviously, there might be more because there might be unknown, but that's just the tip of the iceberg when you see the amount of human rights violations that have happened.
Yeah, I mean, this is very, very important for us to stress. This is a democratic movement. You know, democracy does not just happen once every 5 years at the ballot box. Democracy is a living, breathing, engaging experience. It's a daily effort, and the government and its interaction with the citizens, that's what actual democracy is. This farmers' protest movement, going back to how these laws were initiated, have been a threat to democracy, not because of the farmers. The farmers are not the threat to democracy here. The government is. The way in which the government enacted these laws and the way in which the government has turned a blind eye to its most important sector and its most important group of citizens, and they have completely ignored it. And that's what's actually the threat to democracy. Interestingly, one of the other key important elements that we should just allude to here is how India is structured. You know, we are in Britain here, we have our system of government. You know, as a Scottish citizen, I have a parliament in Edinburgh, and I have that parliament representing me for some things. And then we also have the Westminster Parliament representing the whole country for certain things. Within India, that structure is quite similar. They have, I think, 28 states. Each of those states has a government and a parliament. Now, agriculture and regulation is the job of the state government. The central government and Modi had no role passing these laws. They had absolutely no authority to do it. That's what one of the major issues at the very beginning was. So a huge part of the initial phase of the protests was actually demonstrating within the states. So as we heard before, the Punjab farmers, the Haryana farmers and other states, they were interacting with their chief ministers, they were interacting with their local MPs to seek a recourse for that within the state system. When it became clear that Modi was not going to respect the Constitution of India, when he was not going to respect the state authority, that's when there was the tipping point. That's when the farmer union leaders and the groundswell, the mass group of farmers decided that actually, no, if we want this resolution, it's going to happen in Delhi itself. And that's when that movement took forward that step to really go to the heart of the country, to go to the capital, because it's their capital. That's not Modi's palace. Delhi is not his dominion. It's the people's movement, and it's the people's capital, and it's the people's dominion. And I think that movement has really brought to light, and it's a big question. It's a big question mark for India now. How are they going to respond? How are they going to respond to this stress, this strain, where you've got this government and you've got this prime minister who wants to throw his weight around, and then you've got this big group of citizens who are standing up for themselves. And this is where we come to these human rights violations, which we've seen escalating over the last period of weeks. Initially, the tactics of the government were really immature. It was just to ignore them and pretend that nothing's happening. Modi was basically pretending that they don't exist. And all credit goes to those farmers and this movement who withstood all of this stonewalling, all of this ignorance being directed towards them. It's a huge level of disrespect. There's this saying that Indian politicians love to bring out, you know, to show how in touch with the people they are. They say a phrase, Jai Jawan and Jai Kisan, which means long live the soldiers and long live the farmers. Every country always salutes its soldiers. The soldiers are protecting the nation. But within India, they regard farmers as being equal to soldiers. That's how much importance they have. But if you're looking at the current Indian government,
Yeah.
are they living up to that?
I was gonna say it doesn't seem like that right now. Because it just isn't, is it? And everyone who is listening who might not be basically following all the South Asian sort of Insta pages that have been covering this basically for the entire 2 months, because there have been a lot of human rights violations from early. It has escalated over time, but I remember during like the marches towards Delhi, there were already barricades up. There was already water cannons. There was already gas canisters, tear gas canisters, and things like that. But obviously, it has escalated. Inder, do you know any more like violations and things like that that you've seen?
Oh, countless, countless. This what started off as just the farmers being unhappy with 3 laws and they wanted to be repealed, has now turned into the world's largest protest, and it's become a sort of a laughing stock for the world and for people to see the extent the Indian government will go to silence people and those that are not happy with the government. We as Sikhs, unfortunately, we have always known that. But when it becomes to like an internal matter of India, the average person, the world doesn't seem to care because we're only a small percentage of the world. We're only quite very small. Nobody seemed to care. But with this movement, Punjab stood up first, and all the other states come together and supported. What's going on is now in the public eye because of what's happened. The lady, the Nodeep Kaur, who was a Dalit woman, she's from a lower caste. She's been sexually assaulted and abused and held without genuine reason. She's been beaten, tortured, and God forbid, raped in prison for standing up for people's rights. And now we, as Sikhs, like I said, as Sikhs and as Punjabis, we've always known this. Since before 84 and after 84, 1984. But now the world's seen it. So what started off as just a relatively small thing about 3 laws has now turned into something that is much bigger, and it will not go unnoticed, because like Sharandeep said earlier, Modi government, he tried to dismiss it like nothing ever happened. He didn't talk about it. He didn't mention nothing. Nothing that Modi done was in reference to the farmers. The White House Capitol got stormed, and he tweeted, "Oh, it's a very bad thing," and whatever else he tweeted. But at the same time, the world's largest protest is going on outside in his
On his
capital of
doorstep.
his country, on his doorstep. But he didn't care, because it was only kind of a thing that was limited to mainly Punjab and a few like Haryana and Uttar Pradesh. But now it's become so big because rightfully so, people are being raped, being abused, being beaten. Old people, they're calling us terrorists. There was Pratap Singh Bajwa, he's a politician. He was saying, "You talking to the Sikh people about nationalism?" He goes, "There was a child from Punjab, at least one a month, draped in a tricolour, where he's died serving his country. One a month from Punjab.
Yeah.
One a month, and you're talking to us about nationalism."
Yeah.
The tricolour being the national flag for anyone.
Within the Indian flag. So obviously,
Yeah.
when the body comes in, armed forces, when a person dies, they cover it. And he said, "You're talking to us about nationalism. You're talking to us about terrorism."
There is a lot of hypocrisy there, because as you mentioned there, he's tweeting about the capital in America, but then when it comes to when now the attention's on India, it's an internal matter.
Definitely.
Just to reel off a few more, there's been restricted water supply to the protest sites. I think there's been restricted food supply as well. There's the electricity's been turned off where the protest sites are, and the internet has been cut off.
It's a joke.
Yeah,
Sorry, it's honestly it's a laughing matter.
Yeah,
It's a
which
laughing matter
to external people who aren't from India or don't know about this would think, oh, like that's weird. I didn't even know you could turn off the internet. Like in a Western country, you're never going to experience that.
Never.
When I was in India a few years ago, a similar thing had happened. That when there was protests, they just turned off the internet. To me, it was completely alien, but to them, it's actually a very regular occurrence.
Yeah.
And another thing we've mentioned is journalists. So on Republic Day, at least 8 journalists that are known have been arrested and charged, which comes into the next topic that I would really want to quickly talk about is media coverage, because it's very biased. Okay, it's what researching this was already a troubling task to do, because anytime you put anything into Google, the first results are anti-farmers. It's not an easy thing to research to get all of this. So I hope
India
everybody,
Today.
yeah, exactly,
IndiaToday.com.
that's it, literally it. So hopefully everybody appreciates the research with it, because it wasn't very easy. but not just the India's media, but also you were on Sharandeep was on BBC the other day, and you got some very interesting, in quotation marks, questioning.
Yes, I think just to reiterate the point that you guys have made there about media, information, knowledge, this movement would not have been a success without the independent individuals, independent citizen journalists as well. And I think we live in a very unique time in history where we have fairly independent social media. It's still a little bit controlled, but the vast majority of our social media platforms like Twitter, Instagram, podcasts like Spotify, all of these tools are out with the government's control to a certain extent, and that is the only reason why the truth of this movement is able to get out there. Because those traditional media platforms, particularly within India, many of them are owned and operated by friends of politicians or by big business owners who want to use the media to promote themselves and to influence the politics of that country. So that's a major part and parcel of this movement, has been the independence of that local grassroots journalism. My recent sort of claim to fame, I suppose, has been that rather strange experience on BBC News. I am a founder of a charity called Sikhs in Scotland. We're a community of about maybe 10,000-15,000 Sikhs across the whole of Scotland. Majority of us are based in Glasgow. And we have, as youth or young people in our community, we stepped up to kind of create a separate organisation outside of the local gurdwaras, because we wanted to focus on other things. One of the major successes for the last year of our charity was setting up something called the Sikh Food Bank, which through the coronavirus pandemic served 100,000 meals to those in need, not just in the Sikh community, but across all communities. So that was a major focus of our work. One of the other things that we as a charity started to get involved in was this farmers' rights movement, because we saw how little attention it was getting. The human rights violations that you guys have covered and narrated are very troubling, very sinister. These are things that we expect to happen in China, in Russia, in North Korea, in certain countries in the Middle East, in certain countries in Africa. These are not tactics that you expect to come from what is labeled a democratic country of India. That's not how a democratic government is supposed to operate, which is why we've never lived through anything like that in our own lifetime here in this country. And when you look on, BBC News homepage, which is one of the biggest news sources, every day I look on it and you see a story about Russia, you see a story about North Korea, you see a story about Myanmar, you see a story about the Middle East, you see a story about America, you see a story about Africa, but never ever did I ever see the coverage happening of the farmers' protests, the farmers' movement, and the human rights violations. So we were approached, we got an email through a couple of days ago from a BBC journalist who had seen a letter online that we had written to the UK government. In that letter, we had asked the UK government to engage constructively with India on an official level in any engagements they're going to do about trade talks or anything like that, just to put that statement out there that we would like, as a UK government, we would like Indian government to engage constructively and respond peacefully and listen to the people's demands, because that is their job. So we put that letter out, the BBC approached us and they wrote in an email that we've seen this letter and we'd like you to come on to discuss that letter and the contents of that letter.
Yeah.
So we were like, this is a great opportunity. Finally, our national broadcaster is finally covering a major world news topic. So I prepared some lines and some topics and some facts and figures, just like we guys had talked about here, and to go over things. And it was a short interview. It was maybe 5 or 7 minutes, and that's what I was preparing for. And the initial question that was put forward to me was, a simple introductory question about, what's your interest in this as an international community, outside of India, and that was all fine. And then all of a sudden, the tone changed very drastically to some really bizarre questions about, have you been raising money? Have you been sending money? How much money have you raised? We've not fundraised a single penny for the farmers. I wish I had now, because I could have told her how much money I'd raised and sent to my family and friends in India to support them. But unfortunately, the answer was, I've not sent any money. But then I was like, why on earth is she asking this question? We've not publicized anything. I'm not aware of any big fundraising going on from the UK or other countries. People must be sending some support themselves, but there's not a major effort. So
other than Khalsa Aid, which you referenced in the interview.
So then I was like, okay, well, maybe I'll try and answer her question. Maybe she's asking it the wrong way. Maybe this is what she's talking about. So I was like, well, there's an international aid charity which has a branch in India, and they do aid work everywhere. They help all peoples. And there's lots of old members of the community sitting in the streets in the cold weather, and they need housing, they need water, they need tents. And they've also given them some massage chairs. I was still keeping it kind of lighthearted. And I kind of responded like that. And then all of a sudden, the third question that she brought in started to bring in some really, really disturbing narrative, which was a very, very loaded question. And, I'm quite loath to even repeat it, because I don't want her to get the benefit, and I don't want the BBC and the Indian government to get the benefit of us repeating that narrative. But I do think it's important that we should clearly state what they were saying and why they were saying it. So she asked a question about the so-called critics who say that the movement is being influenced by the Pakistan government to support terrorists. And what she really meant by that was Sikh terrorists, because only Sikhs can be terrorists, apparently. And whether we had influenced and infiltrated the movement. And I was and wasn't surprised. I wasn't expecting the question, but I was prepared for it to be asked, because I knew what I needed to say to that argument. The Indian government has tried everything to delegitimize their own citizens, and they've used every trick under the book. And one of those things they've tried to use is to do media manipulation, where they come up with fake news, fake stories, and they plant it in their friendly websites and present it as independent news. And this is a very, very lazy form of journalism, where they just repeat what the government says.
But it happens all over the world as well. So like during the Trump election, we're seeing it where it's basically divide and conquer. It's the oldest trick in the book. You know what I mean? You create two camps of people and make them fight, which is what's happening in India now. We're seeing it during Brexit. We're seeing it during Trump's election. We're seeing it pretty much repeating over and over and over again. The example, if you don't want to think about farmers, let's go to Canada and say that they're going to change trucking laws, for truck drivers, and then all the truck drivers protest. What the majority ethnic minority groups that are going to be in there are probably going to be darker skin tone. It would be very easier for Canadian media to basically call these people terrorists or troublemakers or anything, which we're already seeing in India. But it's basically just because the majority of that workforce is a specific minority group. Do you know what I mean? It's a very easy thing for then that environment to become very toxic and divisive, and then anybody who isn't part of that ethnic minority group then fights against them, which is exactly what's happening in India right now.
Yeah. So
I
I had
think
to when I got posed that question, I kind of had to think on my feet there, because we didn't have the luxury of time. We've had a really thorough discussion here and covered so much, and we've still not gone through loads of different details. Almost an hour we've been talking here, and I had to try and respond within a very, very short space of interview when she dropped this loaded question in there. And she's, when I called her out on it, I said, I'm really concerned that you're spouting this false propaganda. She didn't just try to say, oh, this is not propaganda, I'm just asking you a question. But when you ask somebody a question, you've researched that question. You have based that on some kind of evidence. And what is the evidence for you to have said that? That's why I'm calling it propaganda, because the question you're asking is trying to introduce an idea which is not true, which does not exist. And I thought about very quickly, how could I, to the viewers who listen to that, because automatically when somebody hears terrorists, everyone gets a bit scared. So I was like, I need to try and neutralize that whole argument. So then I brought in, thankfully, we've had such amazing international support for this movement. And I don't know whether, it's just the organic efforts of thousands and thousands and millions of people promoting and supporting these farmers that have got these engaged media celebrities and social celebrities involved. But I was like, everyone knows who Rihanna is and everyone knows who Greta Thunberg is. And their reputations are clearly established in the media. Everybody knows who they are. So I was like, let's bring them into it. And, I switched the question around to her and I was saying, well, is Rihanna also a terrorist? Is Greta Thunberg also a terrorist? If they have also voiced their support for the farmers, are they also part of this so-called global conspiracy, which you claim to be an issue in your question? And there was no response to that. And I think that was something which I feel very fortunate I was able to think up in time, because sometimes in the heat of the moment you get a bit frozen. But I was able to introduce that. And I think that helped to really just neuter that point there, because this is a global movement. And what she kept trying to do was trying to isolate us and, as you say, divide us up into this small troublesome band of Sikhs causing trouble again, because it's quite easy to blame us because of how we look and because we're confident and because we stand up for ourselves. But this is actually a global movement, and ironically, it's not the Indian celebrities that have stood up for their fans. It's not the Indian filmmakers or the Indian cricketers or the Indian musicians who are standing up for the people that have lived for the past decade watching their sport, listening to their music, going to the cinema to watch their films. It's people from the other side of the world who have analysed the situation and have identified that this is a real human rights cause and a real human rights movement. And I think we've got a lot to be thankful for, but we've also got to thank ourselves and be proud of ourselves. And the farmers have also got to be proud of themselves as well for having that confidence and that assurance in themselves to be able to project their voice.
100%. I couldn't agree more. A couple of points there. I just want to say that during that BBC interview, I think you were very articulate and kept your cool really well. Because as you say, when you're getting bombarded by loaded questions, it's probably easy to lose your rag, which you didn't. And thankfully so, because then you're a good sort of figurehead, I guess, or people will perceive what you said to be accurate, if that makes sense. If you lost your rag, then it sort of just feeds into her sort of messaging. And then secondly is the thing where we've said it throughout this podcast numerous amounts of times, it's not a religious issue. There are numerous religions in India who are different religions who are farmers, and it's got nothing to do with religion. It's more about just farming law. And then lastly, the point that you made with the Indian actors and celebrities, the thing that I want to say on that topic is basically just going forward to anybody who's listening, who's appalled at people not speaking out, just put your money where your mouth is. Do you know what I mean? Like when the next time you go into a movie's released or a song's released or a show's coming out, just remember what side you support. And that's the most effective way to sort of implement your passion for this subject.
Mhm.
I think we've covered basically the majority of the big topics there. So again, I want to thank both of you for your time. Anybody who is listening, if you could share this podcast so more people can be sort of educated, I guess, on the topic. Just share anything to do with the farmers' protest so that you're raising awareness. I will leave both Inder's and Sharandeep's links and things in the description. And again, it's a bit of a different podcast to normal, but I think it would be it would be wrong not to speak up about the topic. So we just had to. And if it helps anybody learn a tiny bit more, then it's job well done.
Man, honestly, this podcast helped me massively. I've learned so much from just listening to Sharandeep myself. It's actually given me a very deeper insight on the law side of it. You know, you're very knowledgeable. And when he told me you was coming on, I was like, you know what, that's a really good idea. It was wicked, man. Thank you, appreciate it.
No worries.
Thank you very much.
No worries, it's my pleasure. And just want to reiterate that the reason that we've emphasized everything for Western comparisons and spoke the majority of this in English is because Indians and South Asians pretty much know what the crack is at the moment. They know what's going on in India. Share this to your non-South Asian friends to raise awareness in different communities of what's happening out there. But again, thank you very much for listening, and hopefully this is a tiny bit of insight into what's happening.